Rain drummed steadily against the old wooden roof, filling the silent night with an eerie rhythm. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, making the old house creak like a living thing. Outside, the sky was ink black, broken only by jagged flashes of lightning that momentarily lit up the dense forest surrounding the lonely house. Inside, an old man sat hunched in his worn-out chair near the window, his tired eyes fixed on the courtyard. He had lived in this house for decades, alone in the quiet company of time and fading memories. But now, he was not alone. Perched beside an old wooden chair in the courtyard was an owl, large and silent. Its golden eyes gleamed in the dim light, locked onto the old man with an unsettling intensity. It did not flutter or fidget like other birds. It simply watched. This was no ordinary owl. It had arrived days ago, appearing out of nowhere, as if it had always belonged here. At first, the old man assumed it had come seeking shelter from the cold, but even when the storm had passed, the owl remained. He tried shooing it away, waving his hands, and even banging on the wooden railing, but the bird refused to leave. It would only blink slowly, as if it understood him, but had already made up its mind. At night, he could hear it shifting its claws against the wooden beams of the porch. Sometimes he would wake up to find it perched outside his window, staring at him through the glass as if keeping watch. A chill ran down his spine. There was something unnatural about the owl's presence. It did not behave like a wild creature. It did not hunt, it did not call out in the night, and it did not leave. It simply remained, always near, always watching. The old man exhaled, his breath shaky. He had spent a lifetime in solitude, but now for the first time in years he felt uneasy in his own home. Why wouldn't the owl leave? Was it waiting for something? Or worse, was it trying to tell him something? The old man, known to the few villagers who still remembered him as Elias, had lived in this house for decades. Isolated at the edge of the forest, his wooden cottage was weathered by time, its walls holding the weight of years long gone. Once laughter had filled these rooms, but now only silence remained. Elias had not always been alone. Long ago, this house had been a home, a place of warmth, of love. His wife, Clara, had tended to the small garden outside, filling it with wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. The scent of fresh bread once drifted from the kitchen, and in the evenings, candlelight had flickered against the wooden walls as they shared quiet stories by the fire. But that was before. Sickness took Clara away, leaving only her absence behind. Before his only son, Samuel, left for the city, never looking back. Elias had not heard from him in years. At first, letters arrived every few months, then once a year, and then nothing. Perhaps Samuel had forgotten him, or perhaps he simply didn't want to remember the past. With time, the house grew quieter. The laughter disappeared, the garden withered, and the bread stopped baking. Dust settled where life once thrived, and Elias found himself speaking less, his words swallowed by the emptiness. Now he spent his days in a slow, unchanging routine. He would wake with the sun, stoke the old fireplace, and sit by the window, watching the world outside move without him. He would sometimes take slow walks through the trees, feeling the rough bark beneath his fingers, as if nature itself was his only remaining companion. Nights were the hardest. The silence pressed against him, and memories crept in like shadows. Clara's laughter, Samuel's small hands gripping his fingers as a child, the warmth of a family that no longer existed. He would sit in his old chair, staring at the flickering candle, wondering if the loneliness would ever fade. Then the owl came. It arrived without warning, perching outside his home like a silent guardian. Elias had ignored it at first, assuming it would leave, as all things eventually did. But it didn't. Night after night, it remained, watching, waiting. For what? Elias didn't know. But for the first time in years, someone, was there, refusing to leave him behind. It was an autumn evening when Elias first noticed the owl. The sun had just set behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the forest. A crisp chill lingered in the air as he sat by the window, staring out into the fading light. The days had become predictable, each one blending into the next. But that night, something felt different. A faint rustling outside caught his attention. At first, he thought it was the wind shifting the dry leaves, but then he saw it, a dark figure perched on the wooden railing of his porch. Two glowing eyes peered back at him through the dim twilight. And, at first, Elias thought little of it. Birds often passed through, perching on his house before vanishing into the night. But this one didn't move. It just sat there, silent and still, staring at him with an almost human-like intensity. Hours passed, yet the owl remained. Even when Elias went to bed, its shadow lingered outside his window. The next morning, he expected it to be gone, but when he stepped outside, it was still there, perched on the same wooden beam, watching. For days, it stayed close. Sometimes it would disappear during the day, but by nightfall, it always returned. Elias tried scaring it away, clapping his hands, shouting, even waving a stick in its direction. But nothing worked. The owl simply blinked, unfazed, as if it had already decided that this was its home now. The longer it stayed, the more unsettled Elias became. It wasn't just the owl's presence, it was the way it acted. Unlike other birds, it never hunted, never hooted into the night, never flew off for long. It was as if it had come with a purpose. But why? Elias wasn't superstitious, but something about the owl's presence felt unnatural. It watched him too closely, stayed too persistently, as if waiting for something. And deep down, for the first time in years, Elias felt something stir within him. A feeling he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in a long, long time. A sense that this owl, this strange, silent visitor, was here for a reason. Elias had expected the owl to leave after a few days, but it didn't. No matter what he did, the bird refused to go. It had claimed his home as its own, perching on the same wooden railing night after night, watching him with those deep, glowing eyes. But then, something even stranger started happening. Every evening, just before sunset, the owl would fly from its usual spot and land in the exact same place, an old wooden beam above the fireplace inside the house. It had never entered before, always staying outside, but now it seemed determined to be closer. Elias frowned as he watched the bird settle on the beam, its head tilting slightly as if listening to something unseen. At first, he ignored it. Perhaps it was just a new habit, but when it happened again the next day and the day after that, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. Why that spot? There was nothing special about it, just the old fireplace, unused for years, its bricks covered in soot and dust. Yet the owl kept returning to the same place, sitting there for hours, unmoving, its sharp eyes fixated on something Elias couldn't see. He tried to distract himself, convincing himself that birds were unpredictable creatures. Maybe it was just comfortable there. Maybe it liked the warmth of the house, but deep down he wasn't convinced. One evening, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Elias stared up at the owl, frustration mixing with curiosity. "What is it that you're looking for?" he muttered. The owl blinked but did not move. Elias sighed and ran a hand through his thinning hair. He had lived alone for so long that he was now talking to birds. But something about this owl's persistence gnawed at him. It was too deliberate, too focused. He shook his head and turned away. It was just an owl, nothing more. But as he walked to his chair, a strange thought settled in his mind. What if it wasn't just an owl? What if it was trying to show him something? Days turned into weeks, and still the owl remained. What had once been an unwelcome intruder was now an undeniable part of Elias's daily life. He had stopped trying to chase it away. There was no point. It wasn't leaving. More than that, he had grown used to its presence. The owl wasn't just an ordinary bird anymore. It followed a pattern, always appearing when Elias woke up, always watching as he moved about his day. When he sat by the fireplace, it perched above him. When he stepped outside for fresh air, it flew to a nearby branch, never too far away. At night, It sat outside his window as if standing guard. Elias didn't know what to make of it. At first, he thought it was just an odd attachment, a quirk of nature. But then, he started noticing something else. The owl wasn't just staying. It was watching him, protecting him. One night, as Elias struggled with sleep, he heard rustling outside. He sat up, his heart pounding slightly. Living alone for years had made him cautious. He reached for the lantern and moved toward the door, but before he could open it, the owl let out a deep, sharp call. Elias froze. It wasn't the soft hoots he had heard before. This was different, urgent, warning. His fingers hesitated on the door handle. The rustling outside continued for a few moments before fading into the distance. Whatever it was, it had left. The next morning, he found tracks near his porch. They were human. For the first time, Elias looked at the owl not as a strange visitor, but as something else. A guardian, perhaps. A presence that wasn't here by accident. The villagers had started noticing. Whenever Elias went to town for supplies, people whispered about the owl that never left his side. Some called it strange. Others thought it was a bad omen. One man even warned him, "It's unnatural, Elias, maybe you should get rid of it." But Elias shook his head. They didn't understand. It wasn't just an owl anymore. It was something more. Something he couldn't explain but could feel. And deep down he knew, this bird wasn't here without a reason. Elias had grown used to the owl's presence, but lately, something had changed. The bird wasn't just watching him, it was trying to tell him something. Every night at exactly the same time, the owl would turn its head toward the old fireplace and let out a low, eerie call. It wasn't the usual hoot of an owl, it was deeper, almost like a warning or a signal. The first time it happened, Elias dismissed it as a coincidence. But when it happened again the next night, and the night after that, he couldn't ignore. The pattern was too precise. As the clock struck midnight, the owl would shift its gaze toward the fireplace, its glowing eyes fixed on a single spot above the hearth. It would call out once, then go silent, staring as if expecting Elias to understand. At first, Elias didn't know what to think. Was the owl reacting to something only it could sense? Was it just an odd habit? But the more he watched, the more uneasy he became. It wasn't random, it wasn't meaningless, it was deliberate. One night, curiosity got the better of him. As the owl let out its usual call, Elias stood up from his chair and walked toward the fireplace. His fingers traced the rough surface of the old bricks, searching for something, anything that could explain the bird's strange behavior. The air felt colder here, as if time itself had settled in the cracks of the wall. The owl remained still, watching him closely. Elias took a deep breath. "What are you trying to show me?" he murmured. His voice felt small in the quiet room. The owl blinked slowly, then turned its head toward the same spot once more. A chill ran down Elias's spine. Something was there. He was sure of it now. But what? His hands trembled as he pressed against the bricks. And then, he felt it, a slight shift. A hollow sound beneath his fingertips, his breath caught in his throat. For the first time in years, his heart pounded not with loneliness, but with something else. Anticipation. Elias's fingers trembled as he pressed against the loose brick in the fireplace. His heart pounded as he applied pressure, and with a faint scraping sound, the brick shifted. Dust and ash spilled from the gap, revealing a small, hollow space hidden behind the wall. The owl let out a single, deep call from above, as if confirming what Elias already suspected. Something had been waiting here, buried in time, hidden from sight. With hesitant hands, he reached inside, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. He pulled it out slowly, revealing an old, rusted tin box, its edges worn with age. The sight of it sent a strange shiver through him. He had seen this before, long ago, in another life. His breath caught as he unlatched the lid. Inside, wrapped in delicate cloth, were a few yellowed papers, a faded photograph, and a small silver locket. His hands shook as he picked up the photograph, his aging eyes struggling to make out the faces. But he didn't need to see them clearly. He already knew. It was Clara, his wife, and in her arms, a young boy, Samuel, their son. Elias's chest tightened. This was from decades ago when they had still been a family, when laughter still echoed through this house. But why was this hidden away? And why was the owl leading him to it now? His eyes fell to the papers, and as he unfolded them, his breath hitched. A letter, in Clara's handwriting. My dearest Elias, if you ever find this, know that I never wanted to keep it from you. I had hoped to tell you one day, but time was never kind to us. There was something I wanted you to have, something tied to the memories we shared. I hid it here, thinking that one day you might need to remember. Not just the pain of what we lost, but the love that was once here. If you ever feel alone, know that you never truly are. Some bonds never break, some souls never leave. Elias's vision blurred with tears. He clutched the locket, realizing now why it felt so familiar. It was Clara's. He hadn't seen it in years. Above him, the owl let out a soft, almost knowing hoot. And suddenly everything made sense. The owl hadn't just chosen his home at random. It wasn't just a strange visitor refusing to leave. It had been guiding him all along, leading him back to the memories he had buried, to the truth he had forgotten, to a love Elias sat by the fireplace, the faded photograph trembling in his hands. The weight of the discovery pressed on his chest, but something even deeper stirred within him. The owl, perched above him, had not moved. Its golden eyes held an intensity beyond mere curiosity. It was as if it had been waiting for him to understand. Thought crept into his mind, one that he dared not say aloud. Was this owl more than just a bird? For months it had watched over him, guided him, refused to leave his side. It had led him to the hidden box, to the memories of the life he had tried to forget. Could it be possible that this creature was connected to Clara? Or to Samuel? He had never believed in ghosts or omens. But this felt different. A memory surfaced, one he had long suppressed. Samuel, as a child, had always loved owls. He would draw them in his notebooks, watch them from the windows, tell his mother that one day he would have a pet owl of his own. They see everything, Papa, he used to say. They never forget. Elias's hands tightened around the locket. His son was long gone. The tragedy of the past had taken everything from him. But now, as he looked up at the owl, this silent guardian that had appeared out of nowhere, he felt something stir inside him. This wasn't just an animal. It was a presence. Maybe it wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, but it was something more than coincidence. Maybe it was a sign, a reminder that love never truly fades, that some connections defy time and death. Tears welled in Elias's eyes, but for the first time in years they weren't from sorrow. They were from understanding. The owl let out a final, soft hoot, almost, as if it could sense his realization. Elias exhaled slowly, a deep sense of peace settling over him. Some things in life couldn't be explained. Some things didn't need to be. All he knew was that he was no longer alone. Elias sat in his old wooden chair, staring at the owl that had become a part of his life. Now, he understood why it had come, why it had stayed, why it had led him to the hidden memories of his past. He had spent years believing he was alone, trapped in the silence of an empty house, carrying the weight of his losses. But now, he realized, he had never truly been alone. Something, or someone, had been watching over him. The owl blinked at him, its golden eyes softer than ever before. There was no urgency in its gaze now, no silent messages left to deliver. It had done what it came to do. A deep ache filled Elias's chest. "You're leaving now, aren't you?" he whispered. His voice cracked, raw with emotion. The owl didn't answer, of course, but it didn't need to. It simply stretched its great wings, perching on the windowsill one last time. The wind rustled outside, cold but gentle, carrying with it the quiet hum of the night. For a moment, Elias wished he could ask it to stay, but he knew better. Some visitors weren't meant to stay forever. Some were only meant to guide us back to what we had lost. A lump formed in his throat as he whispered, "Thank you." The owl let out one final soft hoot, a sound filled with something almost familiar, almost human. Then, with a graceful push, it lifted into the air, disappearing into the vast, endless sky. Elias sat there long after it was gone, staring at the empty space where it had been. His heart ached, but for the first time in years it wasn't with loneliness. It was with something different, something warm. Peace. A single tear slipped down his wrinkled cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He let it fall, a silent farewell to the past. Outside in the distance, an owl's call echoed through the night one last time, and Elias smiled. Life has a way of bringing us back to the things we try to forget. Sometimes it does so through memories, sometimes through people, and sometimes through something as unexpected as an owl. Elias spent years believing he was alone, carrying the weight of grief and regret in an empty house. He thought the past was gone, buried like the old photographs hidden behind the fireplace. But the past never truly leaves us. It waits in the quiet corners of our hearts until we are ready to face it. The owl was never just a bird. It was a messenger, a guide. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was something beyond human understanding. But its purpose was clear. It came to remind Elias that love never fades, that those we lose are never truly gone. And when its job was done, it left, just as people do, just as time does. But the lesson remained. Loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of connection. Elias had spent years believing he had lost everything, but in truth, love had never left him. It had been in the locket, in the letters, in the memories waiting to be found. It had been in the silent companionship of the owl. And perhaps that is what life truly is, a journey of remembering. As Elias sat alone in his home that no longer felt so empty, he realized something important. We do not move forward by forgetting. We move forward by carrying love with us, by letting it live in our hearts, even when those we love are gone. The owl had vanished into the night, but its presence would never truly disappear, and neither would the love Elias thought he had lost. Because some bonds are eternal, some souls never leave, and some stories never really end.